Now, Malcolm Fraser was born and raised and schooled in Edinburgh. Following graduation, he worked as a community architect in Wester Hailes for Christopher Alexander in California.
As did Adam.
No, in California, I was in Wester Hailes.
Yeah, Wester Hailes, yeah.
A theoretician, architect and builder with a radical critique of the poverty of most modern building, and on occasion for artist and philosopher Ian Hamilton Finlay at his neoclassical garden of Little Sparta in the Scottish borders. Malcolm has lectured internationally, held and holds various public and professional posts, and writes on and advocates on behalf of the built environment and business and politics in Scotland in general. He was announced in September 2012 as chair of the Scottish Government's Town Centre Review. Please join me in welcoming Malcolm Fraser. Thank you.
I'm just a builder. I like making buildings. I mean, a very, very kind introduction, but I don't think about conservation theory. I don't think critically about what I'm doing. I think, as any artist should, and any architect is an artist, or any builder should, you look at what works around you. What I like about the buildings of the past is not their Gothicness or their classicism or their relation to this or that theory. It's their qualities of life-filledness. How do people use them? How do they feel alive in them? How do they connect in them? How do they sit in a site? What's their weight? What's their delicacy? All of those things, as an architect, I look at and I like. The cities that they sit within, the pleasure of cycling to work in Edinburgh today, seeing friends on the way there, going through the park, engaging with the buildings, going into the density of the old town. Those are things that I care about. I don't think in particularly critical ways about what I do, and indeed I think part of the problem of where we are is that we overindulge in that and we get caught up in agonies of theoretical architectural bizarreness from some of my modern colleagues, or conversations about the past which end up with us doing eviscerated versions of it today, which is partly my subject today. And I didn't know who I was talking to. I didn't know if some people would see me talk about my buildings before, so I'm not doing that. I'm going to do, and a couple of you may have seen it before, my little evolutionary Edinburgh, how we got here. I'm going to talk about a moment 20 years ago when it seemed that wonderful things were possible, and I'm going to talk about how we've drawn back from that moment where we are now. So this is James's request that I do this, a little look back at the Edinburgh I work with, and indeed Mark and others work within, a little evolutionary history. Because it is, the wonderful thing about this place is that anywhere, any city I like, any place I like to understand why that building's there, why there's that wee street round the back which still has some nice old building on it. And then you realise that the Victorians moved the road from there to there, there's the old place. How these things, how the palimpsest works, how you look at a place and see the richness of history overlaid on it. Edinburgh has that so clearly. And it has it particularly clearly because of the geology. This was a very volcanically active part of the world when Scotland was part of North America, England was part of Europe. The big continent collided into America, and when Europe ripped apart again, it took Scotland and Northern Ireland, not even Southern Ireland, with it. So we're in a different continent to the rest of England for a start. And at that time, all these volcanoes, because there was these enormous geological things happening, all these volcanoes erupted, and the region around here was just about the most volcanically active place on Earth. And then the glaciers swept across from the west, scoured past the castle, left the tail, scoured past Calton Hill, Salisbury Crags, and left this fantastic, bizarre shape. And then castle, or a settlement grew up in the back, and a city was laid out on the tail of the old town behind it. And we forget, the World Heritage inscription is extremely unhelpful because it suggests that the difference between the new and the old town was that the new town was planned and the old town wasn't. And, you know, tourists kind of agree. They think, well, it looks higgledy-piggledy, you know, it's just all happened organically, is the word. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is a free trade zone laid out in a wonder by King David, who was the greatest of Scots kings. He built 13 boroughs across Scotland, imported the Flemish, the French, Germans, continental people, Normans, to populate these boroughs. My name, Fraser, is a very old Scottish name, but it's from French. Fraise, with a strawberry as a crest. Scotland is a rainbow nation. We like incomers, people coming in. And it was all to save Scotland from the poverty of the clan system. So it was set out with these great mansions along the front of this enormous long market, and then these rigs going behind. And in terms of a pattern, you see it all over Scotland. This is on Lewis. And as a Viking longhouse, I think there's something of the longhouse in this enormous public space, and the rigs going behind it. And the town did then evolve organically on the back of this master plan on the hill, the way the closes happened and plots developed, the concept of ownership of a volume of air developed, which didn't happen in England until last century. In Scotland, you could own a flat, a space up there, quite an abstract legal concept in the 13th century, in the early 13th century or 12th century. So that gave us the density of the city, allowed places to develop. So you get this very beautiful plan, and Corbusier, as any good architect, is very acute in terms of how he reads things, described Edinburgh as a filleted fish laid out along a rock. And of course, there's the head, there's the tail, there's the bones. Beautiful plan, and the city developed in an extremely dense way, but also in a very varied way. This is my office, it's just up here. This is Flesh Market Close. See the horizontal building with then, I think it's 17th century, 11-storey tenement at the back of it in stone, very different constructions, so look very different. When you look at the past, you see the sheer variety of responses to technology and culture there, as opposed to the dead hand of the royalist view of history as being all buildings look exactly the same, you look old. I didn't mean to say that Edinburgh didn't have gardens and laid out spaces and wonderful, these closes then also developed in different garden ways further down the town, an enormous variety of space, but in this great market that David I laid out, grandest, largest space in Western Europe, somebody said at the time, this is rather fanciful, but it wasn't quite that dense, but you can see the extraordinary intensity of the place. This is Gordon of Rotham's map from 1647, mid-17th century. And just imagine being in this totally enclosed space. You would think there was no view at all out of it, but rather beautifully, the fact that the ground drops means standing here you'd have seen over the gates and out to the sea beyond. So a very, very controlled view out, and indeed views out through Leith Wynd at the back, etc. The space, well, it's still used for parades, it's a market, it's still a living centre of the city, political events happen there, and indeed the Enlightenment happened here, and I think that it's no coincidence that the intense centre of the European Enlightenment, this overwhelmingly important moment within our history and our modernity, happened principally in Edinburgh. And the fact that the Scottish school system was very egalitarian is one thing behind that. But the fact also that in these courts and markets, everyone had to meet. All classes were in there together. You bumped into people. It was an equality of ideas rather than a class hierarchy that brought people together here. And a wonderful variety of architectures, as I said, and you can read the history, not just of Scotland's architecture going down the Royal Mile, but in the way that we looked at the world. Yes, when you're using stone, you have buildings that, as Prince Charles says, have vertically orientated windows and masonry walls, a historic building, but then look at what you're doing when you have timber, you have verticality, or this very beautiful, this was the first printers in Edinburgh down the Cowgate, my favourite lost building in Edinburgh, Look at the horizontality of the top floor in timber, so it's a very modernist almost, you could say. And of course they wanted even light, so they had a long slot window at the top. If I drew this today and took it to the planners, they would give me a good spanking and tell me it needed to look more traditional than that. It's wonderful to see how modern the past can be, the shock of the old. And indeed, in terms of looking at the Enlightenment, you look at the changes within the old town as well. Here's Gladstone's Land, fantastic tenement, absolutely beautiful and vigorous. Once the whole of the high street had these arcades up the top, and that was the city allowed owners to narrow the street. The high street used to be 6 metres wider. They were allowed to narrow it if they built in stone to protect from the fires that raged through Edinburgh, but they were told that they had to provide a public arcade to the front. That's a shopping mall. The whole of the high street was a shopping mall. Protection from the wind, protection from the weather, and what a beautifully calibrated place that must have been. Of course, thereafter these get filled in and we've lost that beautiful pattern and some of the width. But in terms of talking about the shock of the new or the shock of the old, when the Enlightenment started building in the old town, this sort of stuff happened next to it. And man, when you look at the delicacy of that, how it met the sky, how it brought people up, the subtlety of how it looked after shoppers, etc., traders, and that is extremely brutal. Nothing the modern movement has done is quite so brutal as what the Georgians did in a situation like that. It didn't even respect the street line. But in its sense of mass, its use of not so much materials, the technology of building in masonry, it is recognisably Scottish. It still works, it's still part of this palimpsest. And of course the Enlightenment's main expression was the new town, and what an extraordinarily different layout. We immediately see the radical difference, which of course are still there. We can still understand what we see there. But I love the fact that, well, here's the old town with its closes and courts. It's very, very rich relationships of spaces. Again, going back to why the Enlightenment happened, that there's a series of liminal spaces, gathering spaces behind from public to private. Conversations could go on in these different places. A very rich sort of place to have them. There's a diagram of what the old town's like. Compared to that, the new town, again, it's very brutal. There is the public space, which is a busy street for traffic, and then there is your private salon. And you can see how the richness of conversation that drove the Enlightenment was closed down by the very geometric, controlled fabric it built. And when traditional urbanists tell me that, as Leon Creer does, that all European cities consist of squares and streets and blocks, I look at the old town, there's nothing of that there. And indeed, I've seen proposals for parts of the old town that, because they're traditional, take blocks and lay it over the old town and say that's traditional. Actually, that was called English pattern, and that was called Scottish pattern. The traditional Scottish urbanism is about pedestrians, it's about meetings, it's about the intensity of the city. This Georgian Victorian urbanism is about traffic. Georgian Victorian urbanism is about traffic. So having seen how different they are, it's also interesting to look at the beautiful congruences there are between them. When you set them out like this, you can see there's the broad main street along a ridge, streets falling away to the north and the south, with views out to the Forth, views up to the Pentlands on the back of it. And thereafter, if I was to characterise the old town, I would say, well, it's a defended rock with bridges thrown across to it. That's as simple as I could make it. And then you look at the new town and you see something like that, and that is the old town in microcosm. How did they do that? Did they think about that? Did they use critical theory? Did they say, this is what the old town's about, we must maintain something of that in the new town? Did they have design advisors? Did they have conservation officers? Did they have people telling them they had to do this? No, these were just architects that worked well with the slope, because of course the old town is nothing if not working with the slope. that used the fact that you could build in the air, as we can in Scotland, above each other to create different views, different ownership. So as the slope dropped, you go up to a ground floor, you go down to a front door, etc. And it's quite interesting if you look at what these are called. My conservation colleague will tell me that is called rock-faced ashlar. These are called spear-headed railings. Now, if they haven't rebuilt the defended rock with a bridge thrown across to it, that's, well, they have, basically. I also love the fact that Scots character is very, as Hugh McDermott, the poet, said, where extremes meet, Caledonian anti-Syzygy, we can do the opposite things at once. We're quite friendly, particularly in pubs, but we're quite slightly aggressively friendly too. You know, there's that coming and going, and I love the fact that this beautiful, generous bridge has been thrown out welcoming you in, and then spears have been put around it, rocks have been put around it, whatever. And of course, this is a moat, as Princess Street Gardens were, the Norloch, which is a moat to protect the castle. And that works, at times that works literally, protects you from cars. There is, Paul, where's Paul? There is an apocryphal story that when this happened, there was a scrum of people here watching this, and the police were all holding them back. And there was a voice came from the back, let me through, and some people parted because they thought it was a doctor. And through the crowd ran Ben Tyndall, and he went up to examine the railing, let me through, I'm an architect.
That sounds like Ben, yeah.
Let's see if the railings were damaged. So, only in Edinburgh. I also love the fact that, you know, the Norloch, this loch that became a cesspit that was dammed to protect the castle, then was drained and became this beautiful park, and has kept the definition between the two towns. When I was a wee boy, we lived in Corstorphine, and when my parents said we're going uptown, we got the train in. Can't do that anymore, they've taken away the station. And when my parents said you're going uptown, the vision that popped up in my mind was not of streets and shops or castles or anything. It was of trees, because you came out the train station. What a blessing to have a city where a wee boy will think of the centre of town as being a park. Of course, we also, in terms of what we have a mountain in the middle of town. It's quite extraordinary. Victorians then did very beautiful things with that. Well, they did quite vicious and violent things too. They drove Coburn Street through, Victoria Street through, and actually, perversely, by doing that, they saved the fabric of the old town, because these closes would have all burned. There was no value down them. They were insanitary. You couldn't get a fire engine to them. You couldn't get a front door in them. And actually driving that street through the very delicate medieval fabric. Sorry, I should have explained. This map's wonderful because in grey underneath it has the city of 1495, and in red on top has the city of 1945. So you get a wonderful sense of the courts that were carved out of the town, and then the Victorian streets that were carved through. But having done this very violent thing to get carriages up and down to the station, they supplanted the Georgian architecture by Victorian architecture, which was, I mean, in a way it's pastiche, but it's creative, good pastiche. There's such a thing as live pastiche. They were taking the medieval emblems and elements, and they used it in a very freestyle way to do these plastic ends, this very formed, contextual way to meet the streets at places like this. And I also love the fact that there's West Bow, that was mostly lost. Paul's office is up the top there. And then this wonderfully vigorous, romantic, steep, winding, filthy, crowded street that it was, they then obliterated most of it by driving Victoria Street through. But they've left the bottom, they've left the top, and then where they join, they've done this in this fantastically beautiful way. There's the stairs going down underneath to link, so the stairs from there down to there. They've taken a street across the top of it because they've had this enormous precipitous fall to take into account. There's the stair coming out the bottom, so that's where the old street went down. There's the road on the top, so there's a street on the roof of the houses below. And the section there is fantastically complex. So there's Victoria Street, there's the shops, there's the cafes on top of the shops, and unbelievably then on top of the roof of that there's another street. You're losing your batteries. There's another street, and then there's another street on the top of that. So again, they didn't do it because they'd studied architectural history and thought about the authenticity of the place, and the conservation officer said they had to do this, and they said they had to do that. This is about making more money. You've got 3 commercial front doors where otherwise you would only have 1. And that vigour comes out of that whole idea of commerce. I'm going to get mine.
10 minutes, by the way.
I'm only a third of the way through. What a state. Okay. So there's that sort of jumble. Victorians then infilled it. In modernist times, we could do lovely things with it. This courtyard combines Chessel's Court, the best of modernism, with the best. There's Corbusier's Pilates opening up the street, seen through to the gardens behind. Scandinavian modernism, rational, the best of perhaps a Georgian way of looking at the world. What a wonderful place. I don't think this should be here, but this is me on the grass market after dance space trying to propose public uses of the space, but of course that wasn't good enough. We have to have 1 million acres of boring paving with drinkers out in it instead of a vigorous public use. Where we could have gone, well, here's 3 buildings from the end of the 20th century. It's my poetry library, Museum of Scotland, Fruit Market Gallery. What a wonderful moment that was. There was very few conservation officers or authenticity concerns or anything like that. We as architects felt that we were allowed to experiment. And at that moment, I thought that there was a potential for something wonderful happening in the Old Town, for something wonderful happening in Scottish architecture. Where we are now seems to be a little worse than that. And this is just yesterday from the Scotsman, when the heritage community was welcoming the new Carlton Gate proposals, and the quote was how good it was that we were getting back to low-rise and wide-open vistas. What's happened to a critical examination of the past that we have become so timid that we think this vigorous, high-rise, dense, contained Old Town is somewhere where we need low-rises and wide-open vistas. It particularly relates to my building and the fact that the heritage community is extremely pleased to have supplanted me doing this with Alan Murray and CDA doing it, and taken 2 stories off the top of it and taken away our attempt to get the intricate medieval weave of the Old Town back. So I'm a little bit cross about all that. I'm going to talk about this site, and I think it's worth talking about this site. This is it here, and it's in this very important moment where this is the end of the Roman Deer Street that came up from England. And that swept across the top of the Old Town down to Leith. Another branch went off to Cramond and the end of the Antonine Wall. So fantastically important route. The Victorians demolished it for Geoffrey Street. Victoria Street, Coburn Street are wonderful, but Geoffrey Street is not. It's unfinished, it's long boring, it produces this very awkward back, and it's a car park there. They at least tried to compensate by taking the close right the way through the station. So this very important historic route, and as you see, that's the main way north out the Old Town. You'd be contained within the space, come through this gate, and suddenly this narrow way would open up and this view north. And that's Leith Wynd itself, and I ask you to look at the narrowness of it and the fact that sitting where our building is now is, I think, a 7-storey tenement. They weren't, the density and height was absolutely what that was about. So there's Leith Wynd, there's our building now. So what we were about was getting back that density, noting that it's not Coburn Street, it's one-sided, it doesn't have the very nice tying in, and we were also noting that the Old Town is not about low-rise. Here is a section, there's what we proposed. This is where my office is. I'm sitting on the 12th floor of a toweringly dense building, and to hear the heritage community and the local community scream about this building because it needs 2 stories off the top is absolutely unbelievable. Indeed, it's not just that that's high, so this can be high, but the essence of the old town is that the edges are raggedy, that has moments of height, like the edge of a lovely rug, where there's larger buildings to animate the side of it. And look at our building compared to these very large buildings. We actually need something, and the idea of low rise and keeping very comfortable, that's what's wrong with Jeffrey Street as it is. That's Jury's Inn type, and that's that sort of architecture. Just keep the line the same. That's not what the old town is about. So, okay. So here's our view, and this is the view apparently that we were blocking, whereas that was a narrow view. We kept that view. We had a modern building. We had a building down there. We had a close and a courtyard on top. We had squares overlooking the old town. We were taking the bridge through. We were taking the close through in a similar way as they do on Victoria Street. Anyway, we've been bumped from that. I don't know, because we're too confident or too optimistic or whatever, not collegiate enough. We don't listen to people when they're being miserable, or we try and cheer them up. This is also what I'm doing, and that bridge, I'm trying to get that bridge back. I'm working on this site, I'm looking at the idea of contained views, narrow views, closes, multiple levels, working with Network Rail to try and see whether we can get some vigour back in here. Presumably at some point I'll be sacked and Alan Murray will be brought in to do it a bit lower or something like that. Low rise and open vistas. Elsewhere in Princes Street, these things happen all the time. This is a proposal we did for free in 2004 to say that you could join some of the properties in Princes Street and drive malls through, glaze the end, wonderful views of the castle in the old town, hugely increased values by doing that, because instead of just that frontage, you'd wrap it round at levels all above, etc., etc. Connect through to Rose Street behind, line up with the lanes through here, have a wonderful lane-based protected shopping thing. The council we then passed it to the council, completely messed it up by bringing in a developer who pissed off the owners who were going to agree to work together. And this is what you get instead. And these buildings are catastrophically poor. Why do we have buildings so poor? In the old town too, in the new town, all that's being built is consensual, collaborative and collegiate. That's the things we're told we need. I can look at all these buildings, and I can see how they're a little bit traditional, a little bit modern, a little bit sustainable. Of course it's sustainable, some of them have bits of wood nailed to them. And they are all rubbish, and they are all a disgrace in terms of what we do. My favourite architectural writer is a guy called Owen Hatherley, and here's what he said. I can't disagree with that. And that's me then. And it's not a very cheerful place to end. But I rage and then I go quiet and then I try and work with people and I say we could do this and they say, well yeah, well that will work, okay, give it to us and we'll kick it about for a bit and then we'll do a really bad version of it. And you just get infuriated by that happening. But it's good to stay angry, is my last point. Thank you.